The Tibetan Daotobs are experts in creating tulpas, imaginary forms they control at will, yet which sometimes acquire an autonomous personality. Daotob signifies one who has accomplished supernormal powers, suggesting that the boundary between the real and the imaginary is thinner than one might assume. Most of humanity lives unconsciously in a world of illusion, unaware that what appears stable may be mere projection. In the spirit of Buddhism, everything amounts to just this, a serene appreciation of the relative nature of reality. Existence is not denied. Rather, it is understood that it depends on interconnected conditions. Thus, Tulpas and the surrounding world emerge as expressions of a consciousness capable of shaping, perceiving, and transcending its own creations.
Imagine if a thought cultivated with intensity could take on its form, creating an imaginary friend so vivid that it interacts with you and somehow even influences the world around you. Long before the digital age, explorer Alexandra David-Néel claimed to have brought to life an entity born solely from her mind, a presence as unsettling as it was real. Today, this intriguing phenomenon is known as a tulpa, mental entities born from Tibetan meditative practices, now nurtured by a growing community of tulpamancers on the internet. But how far can the power of the human mind go? Are tulpas mere psychological constructs or actual metaphysical entities? And what are the risks of giving life to a consciousness within your mind? Born from ancient Tibetan rituals and revived by a secretive online community, tulpas challenge everything we know about reality and imagination. Are they the next evolution of human consciousness or a gateway to unknown supernatural forces? Chilling accounts of tulpas turning malevolent and taking control of their creators are intertwined with stories of eternal love and companionship between humans and their mental creations. But beware, creating a tulpa might be more dangerous than you think. Get ready to dive into a world where thoughts take shape and the line between creator and creation becomes surprisingly thin. For centuries, Tibetan monastic communities have been said to have mastered meditative techniques to create tulpas, which were used to teach, inspire, or simply demonstrate the power of the mind. These ancient accounts suggest mastery over one's internal reality, cultivating mental images with such clarity that they could manifest beyond subjective space. Many question whether such creations are confined to the realm of imagination or if they genuinely exist independently. The root of this uncertainty lies in the very mystery of consciousness. If human perception can be fooled by dreams, hallucinations, or altered states, who's to say tulpas are merely elaborate illusions? On the other hand, if they are just mental constructs, why do some historical and contemporary accounts suggest they act on their own? As we reflect on these questions, note how each inquiry draws us closer to the essence of the human experience. Is there anything more intimate than the constant dialogue between perception and reality? Believing in tulpas does not require adherence to dogma, but invites an examination of what the mind can project. It's an expansion of our understanding of human potential. Contemplating this doesn't negate rationality. It acknowledges its complexity. And what if this search for answers doesn't lead to a definitive yes or no? Perhaps the value lies in attentive exploration, in exercising curiosity, and in remaining open to less obvious possibilities. Investigating the existence of these invisible entities, even if it all seems improbable, encourages us to assess the depth of thought, the power of belief, and the influence we have over what we deem real. It is on this horizon of uncertainties that the door to the unknown opens. In the secluded slopes of Tibet, for centuries, monks devoted to contemplative life developed mental practices aimed at mastering their consciousness. In an environment defined by silence, discipline, and reverence, they sought to understand the nature of being through deep meditation. In this context, tulpas emerged not merely as curiosities, but as results of rigorous techniques designed to transcend the ordinary limits of perception. According to historical accounts, these skilled practitioners did not create mental entities for fun or entertainment. On the contrary, the goal was to foster spiritual understanding, stimulate compassion, and demonstrate the mind's malleability. It was believed that by combining concentration, visualization, and specific intentions, one could form mental constructs so vivid they seemed to take on a life of their own. While not everyone achieved tangible results, the concept persisted as part of Tibet's philosophical legacy. At the core of this idea is the notion of nirmanakaya, a term from Mahayana Buddhism associated with the emanation body. This body would be a manifestation projected by enlightened beings, appearing in the physical world to teach, guide, and inspire those who had not yet reached nirvana. For many monks, the creation of tulpas approached this capability, reflecting a deep understanding of the mind as an inexhaustible source of forms, symbols, and meanings. Even without clear consensus, the Tibetan tradition allowed exploration of internal reality where mental strength and devotion built bridges between the visible and invisible. In this sense, tulpas were not isolated phenomena, but expressions of a spiritual path that included asceticism, study, and continuous practice. The few who claimed mastery of such abilities were admired, as their skills symbolized the overcoming of psychological barriers. This cultural heritage influenced Western travelers and researchers, sparking questions about the extent of human imagination. Before becoming the subject of online debates or contemporary experiments, the tulpa was already treated with respect and caution. In the Tibetan mountains, these manifestations were understood as part of a complex mental universe where objective reality and the internal world intertwined in subtle ways. Reflecting on these ancient roots, it becomes clear that the phenomenon is not merely the product of modern fantasies, but a component deeply rooted in spiritual traditions that valued inner growth and expanded perception. Today, reconsidering these origins, it becomes evident that tulpas did not arise from recent theories, but from practices long matured in sacred environments. The historical and cultural weight of this legacy provides a foundation for further investigation. While many now interpret them as psychological phenomena, it's crucial to recognize the spiritual background that shaped them. Thus, it's clear that before any scientific analysis, there existed a context in which the human mind, forged by discipline and faith, nurtured seemingly limitless mental possibilities. In the West, intellectuals emerged with a keen interest in understanding the subtleties of thought and its potential in visible manifestations. Among them was Annie Besant, a prominent theosophist who sought to systematize the study of these mental forms. In her book, Thought Forms, published in 1905 in collaboration with Charles Leadbeater, she provided an orderly classification of phenomena that had, until then, remained shrouded in mystery. Although she did not use the term tulpa, nor limited herself to the Tibetan perspective, the work made an impact by offering a conceptual bridge between Eastern traditions and Western esoteric thought. Besant described three categories of thought forms. First, those that resemble the creator themselves, reflecting individual psychic aspects. Second, those that mimic specific objects or beings, which could supposedly house independent intelligences. And finally, forms that express pure emotional or mental qualities. By outlining these possibilities, Besant suggested that thought was not merely internal and abstract, but possessed a kind of subtle substance capable of traveling, remaining close to the author, or even wandering freely. Thus, what might have once seemed like mere fantasy became analyzed as a more complex phenomenon. These ideas resonated during a time of cultural effervescence when Europe and America were showing a growing curiosity about mystical practices, magnetism, spiritualism, and psychic hypotheses. By proposing a more analytical lens, Besant turned mental creations into a subject of study, broadening the horizon for investigators exploring new models of consciousness. Her approach aimed not just to amaze, but to provide parameters for interpreting poorly understood phenomena, framing them within a rational yet spiritual context. The significance of this systematization also lies in recognizing that thoughts carry intentions and energies. From this perspective, thought forms ceased to be marginal occurrences and became tangible expressions of mental force. By cataloguing them, Besant offered a conceptual vocabulary to those wishing to map mental territories, treating phenomena previously considered eccentric as part of a continuum between the mental and the seemingly real. Thus, her influence extended beyond theosophical circles. By presenting a coherent theoretical framework, Besant sparked interest among researchers seeking to understand the interactions between mind and matter. Although not everyone accepted her vision, the possibility that thought could generate concrete effects drew attention. Even without solving the enigma of the ultimate nature of these forms, Besant's contribution brought the West closer to ideas that had previously seemed confined to remote monasteries. Besant's legacy set in motion a lasting dialogue, driving reflections on the nature and reach of thought. Today, her ideas still echo in academic, spiritualist, and psychological debates. By connecting Tibetan mysticism to rational analysis, she opened fertile ground, inviting inquiries into the very structure of human consciousness. In this way, such thought-provoking reflections remain alive. Among the Western explorers who sought to understand unusual phenomena in Tibet, Alexandra David-Néel stands out for the depth of her investigations. In the early 20th century, she ventured into isolated lands, observing rituals, engaging with local sages, and absorbing subtle teachings. Unlike other travelers, she did not merely document customs. She immersed herself in complex meditative practices, testing techniques that, according to reports, could generate mental constructions as vivid as real people. Her most famous experiment was the deliberate creation of a mental entity inspired by the figure of a jovial monk, resembling a chubby, friendly, and harmless character. At first, everything seemed under control. David-Néel dedicated time, focus, and discipline to projecting the image in her mind, imbuing it with details, personality, voice, and distinct mannerisms. Over the weeks, the imagined form began to appear more consistent, endowed with a kind of independent presence. As the entity grew stronger, troubling signs emerged. The once friendly figure adopted an aggressive attitude, displaying a temperament alien to the original conception. According to the traveler's account, the tulpa became stubborn, malevolent, and hostile. What initially seemed like proof of the human mind's creative capabilities evolved into an unexpected challenge. Was it possible to dissolve something that now exhibited its own will? David-Néel recounted the grueling effort to reverse the process. Months passed as she attempted to regain control over her creation. The dissolution of the tulpa was not a swift act. It demanded persistence and skill to reshape the internal space once it had been molded. Skeptics might interpret the experience as a hallucination or suggestion, but the key here is not to judge its literal truth, but to understand the psychological implications. This episode serves as a warning. Even if one interprets the phenomenon metaphorically, there are implications to consider. By nurturing specific mental images, the human psyche can generate behavioral patterns or sensations with striking resonance. Whether these manifestations are purely internal or something beyond remains an enigma. However, David-Néel's testimony suggests that the danger does not lie solely in deceiving the senses, but in underestimating the mind's own creative and challenging capacity. This story reveals the complexity of the phenomenon, transcending theoretical considerations. Even today, practitioners and enthusiasts cite David-Néel's case as an example of how difficult it is to draw boundaries between the real and the imaginary, and what emerges from the interaction of expectation, belief, and mental discipline. In this sense, her experience not only raises questions, but also demonstrates the seriousness and risks inherent in such attempts. While there are no guarantees that such processes unfold the same way in all cases, the episode illustrates the intrinsic complexity of dealing with such elaborate mental creations. It is not merely about believing or doubting, but about recognizing that the human mind can produce surprising results, whether explainable by modern psychology or not. Thus, the episode remains alive as a reminder. When venturing into realms where imagination is nurtured with intensity, caution is essential. In the information age, the internet has enabled unexpected exchanges, bringing together people with uncommon interests in online communities dedicated to the creation of tulpas. These groups, known as tulpamancers, are no longer confined to monastic environments or secret practices, but thrive openly in forums, social networks, and private chats. With most of these practitioners being young urbanites, often college students, the practice is no longer viewed as exotic mysticism, but rather as an introspective tool to better understand one's own mind. Tulpamancers share techniques for visualizing and interacting with internal entities created through focused attention and repeated effort. Some engage in daily exercises to strengthen the mental presence of these figures, developing personalities, voices, and behaviors within them. In this contemporary context, tulpas are not foreign elements tied to a traditional religious framework, but intimate creations that serve as confidants, emotional companions, or catalysts for self-discovery. Within this diverse community, there are discussions about effective methods for forcing a tulpa, a term used to describe the mental exercises that make the entity perceptible. It is not uncommon for tulpamancers to report long periods of practice before the entity attains a certain level of sensory stability. They exchange stories of subtle experiences, describing feelings of presence, differentiated internal dialogues, and even tactile perceptions. For many, this is a process of self-exploration that helps address anxiety, loneliness, or difficulties in forming direct human connections. A striking aspect is the significant presence of neurodivergent individuals, such as those with autism or ADHD, in the community. Preliminary studies suggest that the difficulty in establishing conventional connections may lead some individuals to find an alternative form of internal relationship in tulpas. In this sense, creating a tulpa becomes not just a mental experiment, but an inadvertent therapeutic resource, alleviating emotional isolation. However, this virtual renaissance is not without its critics. Some argue that the practice may encourage escapism, blurring the boundaries between what the mind produces and what truly exists. Others, more skeptical, view tulpas as mere reflections of the psyche, amplifications of imagination that do not transcend the subjective realm. Yet, for practitioners, such arguments do not invalidate the sense of presence and support their creations provide. When analyzing this new generation of tulpamancers, one notices a movement independent of the Tibetan religious context. The primary motivation now is the desire to understand one's mental structure, exercise creativity, and build meaningful internal interactions. Thus, this virtual community becomes a space for dialogue, learning, and the exchange of experiences. The practice shifts from being an obscure mystery of the mountains to a social phenomenon, a reflection of a connected world where individual subjectivity finds an echo in collective voices. Thus, what once belonged to remote monasteries adapts to a digitalized world. Tutorials appear in forums and social networks, guiding curious newcomers in cultivating internal presences. Geographic barriers vanish, allowing isolated individuals to find affinity in the effort to create and sustain subtle companions. For some, this alleviates loneliness or deepens their understanding of their own mental functioning. Others see it merely as a sophisticated fantasy. In any case, this dynamic reflects the spirit of an era where subjectivity and technology intertwine. A phenomenon once shrouded in mystery among mountain peaks now blossoms as a contemporary expression of the human mind, enriching debates about consciousness, imagination, and the capacity to shape internal realities while expanding previously unexplored horizons of the psyche. In contemporary accounts, the experience with tulpas goes beyond simple mental presence. Many practitioners describe auditory, visual, and tactile sensations that appear independent of conscious will. In developing a tulpa, some individuals notice that these entities not only respond to direct thoughts, but initiate spontaneous interactions, displaying a level of autonomy that surprises their creators. While such experiences raise questions about the nature of consciousness, careful analysis of the phenomenon may provide clues about little understood mental processes. There are cases where tulpas communicate through internal voices distinct from their creators, formulating sentences that seem unrelated to the usual flow of thought. Others describe subtle touches, such as an invisible hand resting on their shoulder during moments of emotional tension, or the sensation of an imaginary object being handed to them by the entity. In more vivid accounts, individuals report glimpsing fleeting silhouettes or hearing specific sounds, distinguishing them from their conscious imagination. These occurrences are not trivial, as they suggest that the brain can simulate complex perceptual experiences even without direct external stimuli. Beyond the sensory aspect lies the question of autonomy. When a tulpa acts unexpectedly, showing preferences, opinions, or even disagreements, practitioners face an enigma. Are they witnessing the projection of unconscious aspects of their psyche, or dealing with something that has, in fact, gained a degree of functional independence? For some, the explanation lies in the flexibility of the human mind, capable of creating coherent subpersonalities. Others argue that these entities are subtle manifestations whose origins transcend traditional psychology. Recent studies, although scarce, explore correlations between phenomena like tulpamancy, ASMR, autonomous sensory meridian response, and a propensity for hallucinations in individuals without psychosis diagnoses. The hypothesis is that certain individuals have a greater capacity to generate internal perceptual experiences capable of deceiving the senses. Whether such phenomena can be voluntarily induced or cultivated remains a topic of investigation. Nevertheless, the mere existence of these accounts demands a closer examination of brain plasticity. The discussion is not limited to psychological explanations. Some insist these experiences indicate the presence of something beyond the internal world. Still, regardless of the explanation adopted, the phenomenon provokes questions about the mind's malleability. The possibility of living with an internal companion that takes initiative, expresses emotions, and affects physical sensations tests the limits of personal credibility. Is consciousness as bounded as it seems, or are there distinct layers operating simultaneously? When considering the nature of tulpas, the key point lies in understanding whether these mental creations are merely internal reflections, projections of the human imagination, or if they achieve a status beyond subjectivity. For many tulpamancers, the phenomenon can be interpreted through a psychological lens. The mind, endowed with remarkable plasticity, can generate coherent subpersonalities with its own vocabulary, temperament, and reactions. From this perspective, there's no supernatural element involved, just the utilization of complex psychological mechanisms that allow autonomous entities to emerge within an individual's mental framework. On the other hand, some argue for a metaphysical origin. In this view, tulpas represent more than elaborate neural patterns. They are manifestations in a subtle plane of existence, interacting with the Creator, not merely as internal fragments, but as conscious presences, independent of the brain structure. Certain mystical traditions suggest that these mental forms could attract external energies, assuming an objective reality, albeit invisible to the ordinary senses. For these proponents, the relationship between thought and the material world is far more fluid, allowing internal images to project onto reality. Between these two extremes lies a vast grey area. Not all practitioners strictly align with one explanation or the other. Some adopt a pragmatic stance, prioritizing the subjective experience over the quest for definitive labels. If a tulpa helps an individual tackle emotional challenges, cultivate empathy, or explore new dimensions of consciousness, the need to determine its ultimate nature becomes secondary. Others draw parallels to phenomena like hypnosis, dissociation, or the literary creation of characters. Thus, the debate doesn't center on rigid advocacy, but rather fosters an ongoing dialogue about what defines reality. Neuroscience and psychiatry studies support psychological perspectives. Recent research reveals that the human brain can adopt multiple cognitive patterns, creating internal voices distinct from the original personality. Thus, it's plausible that tulpas represents a case of intentional mental modeling without invoking unknown forces. Metaphysical advocates, however, argue that if reality is more complex than tangible matter, there's no reason certain mental constructions couldn't become independent of their host, expanding the concept of consciousness beyond individual limits. Without a definitive consensus, the debate continues to spark reflection. As the practice grows and more reports become available, researchers and enthusiasts strive to better understand these dynamics. Meanwhile, the phenomenon keeps challenging certainties, forcing observers to reconsider the boundary between internal and external, between imagination and reality. The true answer lies not in an objective verdict, but in the capacity to embrace uncertainty, acknowledging that the human mind still holds surprises. Facing this dilemma leads to the realization that understanding tulpas involves questioning our very understanding of existence, thought, and creation. Incorporating such questions into daily life requires intellectual humility. Recognizing the multiplicity of perspectives allows us to value individual experiences without dismissing them as irrelevant products of subjectivity. In this sense, tulpas resembles other complex, poorly understood phenomena, reminding us that mental reality remains vastly unexplored. Moving forward demands openness to dialogue, readiness to revisit convictions, and sensitivity to contemplate the veiled aspects of the psyche. The possibility of creating mental entities with a degree of independence raises ethical and psychological issues that cannot be ignored. When one conceives a tulpa, one is not merely projecting an internal image, but cultivating a potential interlocutor with its intentions. Even those who consider tulpas simple mental creations acknowledge that once established, the relationship between the individual and their tulpa can involve feelings, expectations, and even emotional bonds that are hard to measure. This raises the challenge of determining where the creator's responsibility to their creation ends. In many tulpamancer circles, there is a discussion about the need to establish clear guidelines for forming these entities. Recommendations against creating tulpas solely to satisfy romantic or sexual desires reinforce the notion that such creations should not be treated as mere mental consumables, but respected as internal beings with sensitivity. This informal ethical consensus suggests an implicit recognition that the relationship is not one-sided. If the creator begins to notice signs of autonomy in the entity, it's reasonable to assume there's also some capacity for feeling. Another concern relates to psychological effects. There are reports of individuals struggling to control or even dissolve their tulpas, which can result in stress, fear, or confusion. While such cases are not frequent, the possibility of a creation developing undesirable traits or becoming a source of psychological distress raises the question of personal responsibility when engaging in such intimate practices. Some suggest that before beginning the process, individuals should assess their mental state, emotional stability, and maturity to handle the implications. The lack of formal regulation or external supervision means each practitioner sets their standards. While monastic contexts once had experienced spiritual mentors, today much of the knowledge circulates freely on the internet, facilitating access but also increasing the risk of careless approaches. This lack of institutionalized guidance makes self-awareness regarding the creator's limits and intentions even more critical. Moreover, the issue of consent is delicate. If a tulpa exhibits behavior complex enough to express preferences and feelings, ignoring such signs for personal satisfaction suggests an ethical imbalance. In this sense, the creator faces a paradox. At what point does an internal entity, with no existence outside the mind, gain the right to be respected as more than a disposable mental construction? Reflecting on these dilemmas reveals that the practice involves not only advanced mental skills, but also emotional maturity. The deliberate creation of tulpas highlights the need to examine one's motivations, evaluating risks and consequences closely. This recognition can encourage greater responsibility and caution, reminding us that even in subjective realms, ethics has its place. Concluding this exploration, questions emerge about the value of inner freedom, the moral duty toward one's creations, and the importance of maintaining psychological balance. Thus, the reflection on tulpas transcends the phenomenon itself, incorporating fundamental considerations about the human condition and the complexities of the relationship between consciousness and creation. All change begins with understanding your role as a co-creator, and the only way to connect with this divine intelligence is through meditation. We have developed a set of audio tools to help you access this higher state of consciousness. To learn more and gain immediate access, click the link on the screen or in the comments. If this video resonated with you, write in the comments, "It made sense to me."